Thanks for coming out to the third talk in the Ditches to Dishes deeper dive. Uh, this one is Erie Eats on the Erie Canal and Foodways. A little background on this talk, developed in 2021 when I was also interim curator here at the museum. We made a whole exhibit about this. And if you're interested by this talk, check out our gift shop, either here at the museum or online. I wrote a book, Erie Eats, which includes also the remains not the remains, excerpts from a cookbook in our collection written by a barge canal cook. So it's a great value, and you'll probably enjoy it. Other important things to take note of. This is part of our monthly deeper dive series, where we really dive deeply into various Erie Canal topics. You can get an annual pass and tune in virtually or in person for all the ones for the rest of the months and get recordings of all the previous ones. We have a similar deal for our lunchtime lectures. Upcoming lunchtime lectures and deeper dives are on April 25th. So next week, we'll have Chris Sabick from the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum. Will be here talking about shipwrecks in Onondaga Lake that are canal related. And May 8th, Carrie Eaton from our education department, as well as Danielle Nagel of the Matilda Jocelyn Gage Foundation, and Michael Miller, an author who recently wrote the book High Bridge, will be discussing the history within that book. It's a work of historic fiction in which Matilda Jocelyn Gage, noted women's suffragist, and Grover Cleveland, noted two-time president of the United States, team up, and both noted residents of Fayetteville, New York, team up to solve some Erie Canal mysteries. So join us for that discussion. Again, May 8th. But now let's get started talking about the history of the Erie Canal and foodways. Well, 3 for 3. I have not hooked that up. All right, so 3 big questions that we should answer to start off this talk. One is, what is the Erie Canal? What is the Erie Canal corridor? And what are foodways? First 2 questions are pretty easy. Here it is, the Erie Canal, a originally 363-mile long artificial waterway connecting Lake Erie, therefore all of the upper Great Lakes, to the Hudson River, and therefore the Atlantic Ocean and New York City. It overcame 571 feet in elevation change, initially through the use of 83 lift locks, and it was constructed, owned, and operated by New York State at the cost originally of $7 million, just a little over $7 million, really. So that's the canal. It was a transformative waterway constructed between 1817 and 1825. And we generally refer to the canal corridor as areas within 25 miles of the canal. They are really going to see some of the most extraordinary of the changes brought by the canal. And still to this day, to emphasize how important this canal corridor is, I believe the latest number was 80% of upstate New York's population still lives within that canal corridor, the 25 miles of the Erie Canal. So that's what the Erie Canal is, what the Erie Canal corridor is. What the heck are foodways? Well, foodways are the cultural, social, and economic practices relating to the production and consumption of food. Foodways often refer to the intersection of food and culture, traditions, and history. Put in another way, foodways are like every way that food touches your lives, the lives of others, and history. This is going to be all about food. And there'll be a lot about drink too. But if you're interested in that bit, be sure to tune in at 5 for our final talk. The Erie Canal was arising. Okay, all right. So to understand how the Erie Canal transforms New York and its foodways, we've got to look at the foodways of the region before there was an Erie Canal. First, we should highlight the indigenous people who have lived here from time immemorial, the Haudenosaunee, who their 6 nations, the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Tuscarora, Oneida, and Mohawk, kind of covered the entire canal corridor, their homelands. And they had a complex agricultural system in their own right, characterized most notably by what's pictured here, the 3 sisters, corn, beans, and squash. And it's really an incredible bit of agriculture, agricultural practice, horticultural practice, that might be the word I'm looking for. All 3 would be planted together in mounds. The corn grows first, growing straight and tall. It then acts as kind of a stalk for the beans to grow up around. Beans critically replenish soil with nitrogen, which gets depleted by corn and squash. Meanwhile, the squash grows out at the base of this mound, and it's long, and their large kind of prickly leaves provide a canopy for the root system of the other plants, protecting them from pests and also trapping in moisture to keep them watered. So this is a really effective system. The Haudenosaunee practice this, which is supplemented by gathering of naturally occurring plants, notably berries, especially strawberries. They're pretty important in Haudenosaunee culture. Agriculture is done by women in Haudenosaunee society, while the diet is also supplemented by hunting and fishing of wild game. There's also some interesting forest management practices there, including controlled burns, which one direct game towards wading hunters. On top of that, it produces a meadow ecology, which is more biodiverse generally. It's a pretty interesting system. So that is the form of agriculture and food production practiced by the Haudenosaunee. But how exactly are they eating these products? So an interesting thing about traditional Haudenosaunee corn, it is much harder than the corn we're familiar with today. So you actually have to soak it in water to become kind of soft enough to be ground into things like meal. But primarily, the Haudenosaunee are making soups, stews, roasted meats, etc. Europeans enter this discussion in the mid to late 1600s, traveling up the Mohawk River and also moving into or traveling up the Hudson River and then into the Mohawk River Valley. While the Mohawk River Valley offers a lot of really good farmland and improved transportation than across the rest of the Appalachian Mountains, which stretch all the way from Georgia to Maine, it wasn't the ideal transportation route at this point. There are a lot of rapids, waterfalls, etc., that made transportation difficult. So it was hard for European settlers to that region to really produce agricultural goods for market. This is also, we should note, much of this time period that we're going to be discussing, most people are practicing agriculture and are farmers. It is a huge and important industry. So most settlers in this region are producing kind of sustenance farming, enough to feed themselves and their family, and maybe have a surplus that they can ship to market, though it is not super profitable. Things begin to change after the revolution. So in 1779, there is an important moment that involves food in a lot of ways. What's called the Sullivan-Clinton campaign, often qualified as genocide. American soldiers go through the Finger Lakes area and intentionally attack Haudenosaunee villages and light crops on fire. It's estimated about 100,000 bushels of corn are lit on fire by these soldiers in the Finger Lakes area, leading to mass starvation amongst the Haudenosaunee. And this kind of quote unquote clears out the area for future settlement after the revolution. Also, Revolutionary War veterans are rewarded with pensions of this newly acquired land in what's called the military tract, with the hope that they will move out there and start up farms, etc., in central New York. However, these new settlers are confronted with the same issues that those Mohawk Valley farmers had with before, which is there was not a great way to get their product to market. And sustenance farming is not a fun way to live in general. So that brings us to the era around the turn of the 19th century. And foodways are closely linked with the original idea for the Erie Canal. And that can be really exemplified with this man. This is Jesse Hawley. He was a grain merchant near Seneca Lake in the Finger Lakes. He was milling grain and attempting to use the natural waterways and the Western Inland Lock and Navigation Company canals to transport his grain to market. Didn't go too hot for him. He went bankrupt and was put in jail for how good of an idea that was, right? He ends up in debtor's prison. There, he has time to reflect on why his grain forwarding business had gone out of business, as well as study new maps and number of books, etc., on the topic of canal building. And comes to the conclusion that what happened to him and others who want to pursue similar agriculture-related jobs could be prevented if a canal was constructed across New York State. It would also allow people to have access to the vast salt springs of central New York, as well as another important aspect he highlights in his series of 12 essays, the Hercules essays, written for the Genesee Messenger. Eventually, those essays would end up pretty influential. They'd find their way into the hands of a number of prominent New Yorkers, as well as just the general public as well. And in 1817, it would be authorized that a canal would be dug across New York State. And they started digging July 4th, 1817 in Rome. And food plays an important role in the story of the Erie Canal at this point as well in its construction. That's because the state, while building the canal, hires contractors to get the job done in half-mile to 2-mile long stretches. And the primary way and these contractors will pay their workers is not in cash. That's pretty hard to find on kind of the frontiers of New York, which the area where the Erie Canal is being built is. Instead, workers are largely paid in room and board, or place to sleep and food to eat. These work crews, they'll have to hire entire new positions to feed these large work crews. Notably, women take up this role. This is an incredible artifact in our collection. This is the kettle of Christine Davis, the daughter of immigrants. Her husband was digging the Erie Canal, and she was hired to work as a cook on the project. This picture here does not do the kettle justice. It is 18 inches wide and 1 foot tall. It's a big old kettle. and it could feed a lot of folks. The Davises would work on constructing the canal with Christine serving as cook. And then they would actually move on to the Ohio Canal system, which was being constructed following the opening of the Erie. Yeah, this incredible artifact actually followed the Davis family all the way to Arkansas, where it was actively used until it was donated to us, primarily for the production of apple butter. So that's a pretty interesting artifact we have, and it tells this really great story about how integral food production and consumption was to the building of the Erie Canal. It wasn't just food they were being paid with either. They also were paid in tremendous amounts of whiskey, between 10 and 15 ounces a day. And again, a physician is hired to provide the whiskey rations as well. So a lot of people were getting paid to make sure canalers were eating and drinking. It should also be noted that at this point in New York State history, when the canal is being constructed between 1817 and 1825, slavery is still legal in New York State. It's still practiced. The primary job functions of enslaved people revolve around foodways, primarily its production and its service. So men, often male enslaved people, would often work in agriculture, doing farming, while women who were enslaved often ended up doing domestic work that included cooking and serving meals, etc. An excellent example of this is the man depicted here, whose life is tied up with Erie Canalway foodways in a lot of different ways. This is the Reverend Thomas James. He was born in Canajoharie in the Mohawk River Valley around 1803 or 1804. He was born enslaved and worked the first about 2 decades of his life doing agricultural labor in the Mohawk River Valley. However, as the canal was built through Canajoharie, Thomas James saw his opportunity and took his freedom, following the canal's newly surveyed route all the way across the state to Lockport, and then across the Niagara River to Canada. There he got a job working digging the Welland Canal, Canada's response to the Erie. It's around the same time period. It's very likely he was probably also paid in room and board as well. But after a few years, digging a canal is not a fun job. He moved back to New York, to the booming canal town of Rochester. More on that later, where he found work in a canal-side warehouse, most likely warehouse its primary cargo was flour. There, he learned how to read and write, eventually becoming in charge of the entire freight shipping operation for this line before he would leave, become an ordained minister in the AME Zion Church, and then he became a prominent abolitionist minister, founding Syracuse's AME Zion Church as well as Ithaca's. And he has a fascinating life. There's a lot more to say about Thomas James, but we don't have time to really go in. Check him out. Yeah, so here's a guy who, life is greatly impacted by the changing foodways of New York. So let's talk about once the Erie Canal is completed, because that will radically transform New York State's foodways. And we can see a few examples here. One of the first industries to really benefit from the opening of the canal is salt production, which its epicenter is right here in Syracuse. Even before the full canal is opened, the canal between the Mohawk and Seneca rivers is complete by 1820. And we have accounts from the 1820s, from 1820 in the Onondaga Journal, talking about how the price of a barrel of salt has been cut in half due to just a third of the Erie Canal being opened. And that's an important thing to note about a lot of these commodities. Things like salt and grain, they're bulk commodities. You need to be able to transport them and sell them as cheaply as possible to remain competitive in an open market. Um, yeah, so Syracuse is one of the first major beneficiaries of the canal. At its height, it will produce between 70 and 80% of the nation's salt. And we can see it here. You've got the giant salt drying beds. So salt brine, there's underground salt deposits, which will be pumped up to the surface by water, producing a salty brine. Originally, you would boil those away, but we have accounts that by 1848, they were burning about 1,000 cords of wood a day. The whole region was becoming deforested, so it became more and more expensive to do the boiling method. Eventually, they would do solar evaporation, which is kind of the iconic image of Syracuse Canal production nowadays. Yeah, so Syracuse becomes known as the salt city. It's making so much salt. Also springing up along the route of the canal. So now people can travel much faster. Before the opening of the canal, it took about 30 days and costs around $100 a ton of wheat, really, to go from Buffalo to New York City. After the canal opens, that's cut to 5 to 7 days, and it costs less than $10 to transport the same amount of stuff. So tons of people travel up and down the canal, taking advantage of this faster and cheaper transportation route. And those people need places to sleep. They need places to eat. So in every canal town, you have inns, taverns, and hotels opening up all along the canal's banks that offer you a place to sleep, but also a place to eat. We have pictured here in the bottom corner the Syracuse House, Syracuse's finest of these early hotels. Yeah, you could stay there for a night, for a day, for however long you want it, really. The Erie Canal also becomes an important tourist destination because it conveniently will drop you off right by Niagara Falls. These new tourists, they need places to stay as well. An interesting thing to note, so slavery by this point has become illegal in New York largely, but Black Americans are still marginalized largely, so they often end up working in these hotels, which will become important later when we discuss kind of the Underground Railroad, the abolition movement. So yeah, that's some new stuff that's arising in upstate New York along the canal's banks. But then over at the other end, we see another way the foodways of New York are transformed. What we have there pictured is a lock. Another transformative aspect that the Erie Canal brought to America is the traffic jam. It takes about 15 minutes for a boat to pass through a lock. So hundreds of boats are traveling on the canal at the time. It can often take hours, sometimes at incredibly busy points of the season, days to pass through a lock. So you got some time on your hands, which is a good time to go grocery shopping, for instance. This is a grocery store that's set up at a lock. You'll also notice that it has a side building for oats and hay. You know, all these canal boats are being pulled by mules and horses. They need to eat too. So there's a booming industry and, you know, animal feed as well. Also, the canal allows these grocery stores to be filled with goods that people would never have really had before in this section of New York. There's a famous toast when the canal is opening. A state assemblyman, I believe it was, toasted to salt and pork going down. So the salt and also pork's a big industry, and oysters and tea coming up the canal because everyone's eating oysters and stuff, and you can get things like tea and coffee and sugar in these inland towns that you never had been able to get before unless you were extraordinarily wealthy. And even then, it doesn't matter how much money you have. Oysters will go bad after a few days, right? Yeah, so These are some of the ways the Erie Canal transforms New York. Um, and then the place you can really see this the most is in Rochester. Rochester, on the banks of the Genesee River, right next to the high falls of New York, possibly benefits the most initially by the Erie Canal. In fact, after the first decade the Erie Canal is open, it sees 500% population growth. So why is that? Well, like I said, they're right on top of what's pictured here, the high falls of the Genesee. Tremendous amounts of water power. The Genesee Valley, meanwhile, is an incredibly fertile valley. Farmers, now that they're able to get there via canal, can open up large farms, especially producing America's staple crop at the time, wheat. And the Genesee between Letchworth State Park, what's now Letchworth State Park, and the high falls of the Genesee is pretty navigable. You can easily take kind of a raft or some bateau, smaller boats down the Genesee River to Rochester. So it's easy to go grow grain, Genesee River. It's easy to get it there to Rochester. Then you've got this tremendous water power, which can be harnessed in the form of mills so that grain can get ground up. However, what we talked about earlier, the key to selling bulk commodities is to eliminate as much overhead as you possibly can. So when the Erie Canal comes through, it completes the circuit by making incredibly cheap transportation. So Rochester booms after the canal allows this flour to be transported cheaply and efficiently to New York City. Rochester at its height is grinding 25,000 bushels of wheat a day. So that's huge. It becomes known as the Flour, Flour city. And the word boomtown is literally coined to describe Rochester at one point because it explodes with growth, large ways due to foodways. And we can see in this picture over here the importance of the canal's location. This is an image from our collection of one of the first flour mills, the City Mill. You can see it's right up next to the Erie Canal, so you can ground your flour and put it on a canal boat right away. But it's not just New York that is transformed by the Erie Canal. This is an incredible map that shows the reach of the Erie Canal. You'll notice the yellow border that goes all the way to Wisconsin. Those are the areas whose primary destination is the port of New York via the Erie Canal. So that's pretty much all of the Midwest. All the goods that they produce are traveling down the canal. The red line is a projection of when they enlarge the canal from 40 feet wide to 70 feet wide of how extensive the canal's reach would be after that. That never really comes to fruition because they didn't count on railroads being opened. But you can get a sense of the scale of where is impacted by the Erie Canal. And it's also important to note here because foodways will be massively transformed by this as well. So for about a generation after the canal opens, the Genesee Valley is the breadbasket of America, producing the majority of America's wheat and flour. However, you've also got the Erie Canal allowing people to efficiently be able to migrate westward into the Great Lakes region. And there set up their own farms and communities. There's also a number of new canals that are built around there that help facilitate that. And you'll notice things about Indiana and Ohio geographically. First, they are farther south than New York. Second, they don't have the hills and mountains of New York. They have much better soil, both of which combine to make them better places to grow wheat. You've got longer growing seasons being farther south, and the soil is better there. There's less rocks, etc., it's easier to farm in a place like Ohio or Indiana. So within about 30 years of the canal opening, those areas are the primary wheat producing centers of America, which really hurts Rochester. It stops being the flour city with an FLOUR. However, Buffalo still is a major transshipment point for grain, so flour is still primarily milled along the canal corridor. Just all that wheat gets sent to Buffalo now instead of Rochester. This would be bad for New York, and really farmers in New York. They had invested a lot in growing things like wheat and corn. What were they going to do? They can't compete anymore with these Midwestern states. Well, here's what they did. They diversified their crops. They began producing higher value crops, things like vegetables and fruits, dairy. Every town along the canal kind of develops its own specialty product. You have places become known as like Lyons, it's the peppermint capital. Phelps is the sauerkraut capital of the world. Little Falls, the cheese capital of the world. Mohawk River Valley really focuses on dairy products, so cheese, milk, etc. Up top, we see another innovation that occurs on the canal. These are gladiolas in Syracuse, but the first ever commercial nursery growing, flowers and fruit trees, etc., is in Rochester, New York. And Rochester transitions from producing flour to producing flowers. Thus, its current nickname, the Flower City. So, yeah, it's doing that. We have a few other interesting images from our collection. Up in the top corner, we see some folks gathering hops in southern Madison County. Central New York would be the primary producer of hops in America for much of the 19th century. At one point, producing the three counties of Oneida, Madison, and Otsego County would produce about 80% of the nation's hops in the 1880s. Then down in the bottom corner, we've got some gentlemen in Canastota picking their signature crop at the time. Now, a lot of people would think that that's onions. It's what they're now famous for, but this is actually an image of them harvesting celery. Canastota was well situated to produce celery for quite some time. Eventually, they would transition over to onions. Both grow well in the rich mucklands around the shores of Oneida Lake. And New York would indeed be America's largest agriculturally producing state into the 1870s and have the most diverse agriculture of any state. The top 5 producing counties for vegetables in America in the 1870 agricultural census are all New York State counties. 3 are current boroughs of New York City. Then the other 2 are Monroe County, where Rochester is located, and Erie County, where Buffalo is located. So yeah, this is kind of a boom time for New York State agriculture, and farmers are making a lot of money producing these diversified products. But some folks are left behind by that change over to wheat. However, New York and the Canal Corridor find other ways to profit off of the movement of a lot of agriculture west. And that is through industrialization is also happening at this time. So we see on the right side a couple companies that grow up right alongside the canal, producing agricultural equipment. You've got up top the Syracuse Chilled Plow Company. This produces a new form of plow. It's, as you can see, a gigantic factory employing hundreds of Syracuseans. And the plow it makes is ideal for turning up the soil of the Great Plains region. It would eventually get taken over by John Deere. You also can see at the bottom there an iconic image of the canal. If you look across the canal, though, you'll see another canal side industry. That is the factory of International Harvester at the time. And you can see a bunch of these reaping combines. The famous McCormick Reaper, which revolutionized grain production, first commercially produced successfully in Brockport, New York, right alongside the canal. Their factory was there, canal side as well. Then also the canal, eventually railroads really start to outpace the canal. They're faster, they can pull more by the end of the century. However, the canal, because it's now a less efficient form of transportation, you got to charge a bit less money to convince people to travel on it. So if you've got goods that can move slowly, especially food products, you can afford to put them on a canal boat because they don't have to get anywhere too quick. So the Erie Canal by the late 19th century becomes a major epicenter for the early canning industry in America. We see pictured at the top in Canajoharie, the beech nut factory. Beech nut starts out making vacuum sealed hams. They eventually expand into a number of other agents, products. They have over 100 eventually, most famously chewing gum and baby food, which they still produce to this day. These industrial workers who are in these factories also have to, things are changing for them too. When you used to work on the farm, which again, most people did, you'd go in, back to your house, have lunch, have dinner, etc. However, when you're working at a factory, you don't have that luxury anymore of going home because your home could be relatively far away and you have a limited time, if any, to go on a lunch break. Same with if you're a clerk in an office, etc. So we really start seeing the origins of restaurants at this time period to service these growing towns and cities and allow people to go eat places, right? Pictured at the bottom is Clinton Square in Syracuse. And that kind of grand building is the Empire Hotel, which had a famous restaurant in its bottom. It had an early heated buffet. So yeah, in many ways, things are changed. Also, the Erie Canal will spur thousands of immigrants to move to New York, primarily from Europe, and all of them bring with them their own unique foodways from their home countries. Pictured up at the top are employees at the meat processing factory of A.C. Hoffman. Still exists today as the Hoffman Sausage Factory. They're primarily German immigrants. Myself, my own numerous generations of my family, German immigrants who worked as butchers up on the north side, just a couple blocks away from the Oswego Canal during this time period. You also have immigrants like John Greenway down below, founding these enormous food production and beverage production industries. That is Greenway's Brewing, a huge canal side facility right on the banks of the Erie Canal. And these immigrants wouldn't just bring their own foodstuffs with them, they would also innovate using their existing food knowledge. A lot of immigrants, especially early on in the canal's history, especially here in Syracuse, start working in the salt fields to the north of here, boiling away that salt, right? You've got primarily Irish and German immigrants at this time, both peoples who love a good potato. So they bring them with them for their lunch, toss them into the boiling salt vats, and once the water had boiled away, you'd have a nice salty treat. And thus was born, oops, not the beef on weck, the salt potato. Um, Now to talk about the beef on weck. You've also got the Erie Canal transforming New York socially. In addition to immigration, you've got a lot of reform movements, one of which is the temperance movement. Eventually, temperance advocates, to try to get people to drink a bit less, said you needed to buy food if you're going to buy beer. As is the case today as well, immigrants were often forced to live in kind of the least desirable neighborhoods. And in this time period, that was around the canal. It's this smelly ditch with all this hard labor going on around it. It's not the best neighborhood. So a lot of immigrants end up there in Buffalo. The primarily German neighborhood kind of concentrates around the canal. So after this law is passed, German tavern keepers are pretty upset about it. But they think back to their traditional foodways from Germany. Roast beef, big in Germany, right? Also full of salt. So too are Kummelweck rolls. So they devised to make the saltiest possible food they could, which would encourage people not to drink less beer when they bought the sandwich, but more. And thus is born Western New York's famous beef on weck sandwich. And yeah, that leads me well into kind of the other innovations brought about by the canal. New York recognized that, it needed to keep fighting to stay relevant agriculturally. That, the golden days of wheat production, for instance, weren't going to last forever. And New Yorkers wanted to ensure that they would have the best agricultural practices. So New York heavily invests in ensuring that New York is at the cutting edge of agricultural practices. In 1848, New York begins the New York State Fair. Nowadays, the fair's kind of just a social event, and it was back then. But also the fair served its primary function was to allow farmers from across the state to go and discuss and learn about the latest in agricultural technology and practices. Nowadays, it's kind of cute when you see the pig that won like a blue ribbon or something, right? But that does serve a purpose. Here we have an image of prize-winning cattle at the New York State Fair. And you want to win the prize-winning cattle because that means you have the best cow in the state or what have you. And everyone else is going to want to improve their cows. So they'll hire your prize-winning cow to make more cows, right? And that makes sure that New York stays competitive overall in the cattle industry, et cetera. Yeah, you guys understand animal husbandry. So you've got that. Down at the bottom, we see another image from the fair. This is a Case tractor display. So you go to the fair and you'd see tested out the latest in agricultural equipment, like these tractors. This one can drive up a hill. Exciting. Also, as still happens today, people would also go to the fair to experience, the latest in culinary traditions and techniques. Back then, they weren't just seeing what things you could deep fry, but instead you could get things like this non-stick pancake flour. Test it out. Try it. Amaze the family at home when you buy your non-stick pancake flour. New York will also invest in other ways to continue innovating agriculturally, including in Ithaca, a town connected to the canal. They will help fund the creation of Cornell University, which Cornell's ag school is still incredibly important to this day, studying the latest in agricultural techniques. All right. However, I've already kind of alluded to it. With the railroad, the canal became less and less viable. However, especially grain merchants in Buffalo and New York City were very concerned about the possibility of the Erie Canal closing down in the late 1800s, early 1900s. They feared that, pictured here, the New York Central Railroad would have a monopoly on transportation and could therefore charge those grain merchants whatever they wanted to get their grain between the ports on the Great Lake and ports on the Atlantic. Turn of the century, spearheaded by Governor Theodore Roosevelt, along with many others, a new, larger barge canal is authorized, one that can take ships that are nearly 10 times larger than previous Erie Canal boats. The primary function of this canal will be to haul grain during its heyday. Its height, I believe it's in 1933, it moves 31 million bushels of wheat in 1 year. It also moves a lot of other agricultural products. My favorite is a shipment of eels from Oswego down to New York City. And you can see the importance of grain, though, to the barge canal if you go to any of its terminuses, or at least you used to. Back in Oswego, they had these giant grain elevators right alongside the port of Oswego. They were recently torn down. But if you go to Gowanus Bay in Brooklyn, there's this absolutely massive grain elevator there that was produced primarily for the barge canal and its use. And indeed, the barge canal would be important for food transportation into the 1950s. And then in 1959, the St. Lawrence Seaway is constructed, kind of ended that. As the years went on, New York lost more and more of its competitive advantage as railroads crisscrossed the nation. You could easily access places like Southern California, or just California in general, Southern Texas, Florida, all of which have infinitely longer growing seasons, can produce much more diverse foods, etc. And New York State farmers could compete less and less, really. However, with the 20th century, and really since the 1960s and 70s, kind of, let's say the 21st century, things have changed a bit. And let's look at Syracuse as a case study to see how foodways have changed throughout the canal corridor in just maybe the last 50 years or so. After World War II, you've got this really very closely interconnected transportation system. So what I was talking about with bulk selling things, other parts of the country can now compete New York agriculturally in almost every sense of the word. You've also got new food production techniques, things like pasteurization, etc., that make food more homogenized, right? Nowadays, Wonder Bread doesn't seem that wonderful, right? But there was a time where, you couldn't guarantee what the quality of your bread was like, that the loaf you bought one place was going to taste like a loaf of bread you brought somewhere else. However, new food production techniques allow us to ensure the quality of things like flour, like bread, all across the country. It's the same. However, on the flip side of that, food gets more homogenized. People started using things like DDT and other pesticides to produce and protect foods. 50s and 60s, people start really questioning that. And like what goes in to making food all kind of taste the same, etc. And so you start to have things, people start thinking more about where their food come from, how it's produced. You start seeing things like the organic food movement, the farm to table food movement, uh, buy local sorts of campaigns start to happen. Over the years, agro-tourism increases. A lot of farms, especially in upstate New York, pivot away from making food for commercial production. I mean, look at all the apple orchards up here. You know, Beacon Skiff, they're not making money on selling apples. They're making money on having you pay them to go do manual labor for them for fun. Maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, but they're making a lot of money doing that, selling you a donut when you go up the Beacon Skiff, etc. What? Okay. Great example of how that's manifesting itself is in the Evergreen restaurant, just 2 blocks down the road. That is in the oldest building in Syracuse itself, a former canal double-ender building. You can see all these different food trends kind of manifest on their menu. Most of their ingredients are produced in New York State. They have a lot of organic recipes as well as gluten-free ones to kind of cater to changing food tastes, as well as, I don't know, how food has changed our bodies as well over the generations. We also have another incredible series of restaurants up here. This is the recently opened Salt City Market. So immigration did not end at any point during this story. So, right, you had those German and Irish immigrants primarily in that first wave. When they're building the barge canal, you have a lot of Italian and Polish immigrants moving into the area, contributing a lot of incredible, nowadays, just normal foodstuffs in Central New York's diet, things like tomato pie and chicken wings. Up here, Salt City Market is highlighting some of the new ethnic cuisines that have entered the canal corridor in recent decades. In this picture alone, you've got soul food from the south. Big in Burma, there's a gigantic Burmese population all along the canal, a Vietnamese restaurant, and a Middle Eastern cuisine restaurant. So Erie Canal foodways are continuing to change here in the 21st century. Also, I'll highlight down there, another area that's been changed is beer production. We'll talk a lot more about that at 5 in the Erie Canal talk. You can see places like craft brewing, which has taken off in the last 30 years or so. Places are even partnering with their local Erie Canal museums to make Erie Canal beers and stuff. So that is the end of the presentation. Are there any questions?
Someone was able to know where the map that had the colored lines is from.
No idea which map that is.
The one that shows the region.
Oh, that is a David Vaughn map. It's in the New York State Archives. It's this one. Yep. Yes. New York State Archives, produced by David Vaughn. Craig Williams did an incredible lunchtime lecture on him last year. So sign up for a lunchtime lecture annual pass to learn more.